Picture this. You wake up. You haven't showered in 6 months. Your hair is basically a small ecosystem, and yet somehow you're not dead. In fact, you're thriving. Welcome to being a human being roughly 30,000 years ago, where hygiene meant rubbing yourself with mud and calling it a day. And weirdly, it kind of worked. So today we're answering the question that's probably crossed your mind at least once while sitting in a hot shower with 3 kinds of exfoliating scrub. How on earth did ancient humans stay clean without soap, without shampoo, without a single bottle of anything that smells like ocean breeze? First, let's kill a myth right out of the gate because this one is everywhere and it's wrong. The idea that ancient people were just filthy, stinking cavemen who rolled around in dirt their whole lives and never once considered bathing? Nonsense. Total nonsense. Humans have been obsessed with cleanliness for basically as long as we've been human. The methods were just different. Sometimes weirder, sometimes, honestly, smarter than what we do now. Let's start at the very beginning, because that's apparently a very good place to start. Early humans, way back in the Paleolithic era, didn't have soap. They didn't have running water they could just turn on. What they did have was rivers, lakes, and a whole lot of common sense. Water was the original cleaning product, and honestly, it still kind of is. Archaeologists believe early humans regularly bathed in natural water sources, not because some ancient influencer told them to, but because it felt good and it got rid of the stuff that attracted bugs, parasites, and predators who could smell you coming from a mile away. Staying clean back then wasn't about vanity. It was survival. If you smelled like rotting meat and sweat, you were basically ringing a dinner bell for every predator in the area. But water alone doesn't get grease and grime off skin that well, so early humans got creative. They used things like clay, ash, and sand as abrasive scrubs, essentially the world's first exfoliators. Millennia before, some company decided to charge you $40 for a jar of ground-up apricot pits. Clay in particular was a big one. Certain types of clay have natural oil-absorbing properties, which means smearing it on your skin, letting it dry, and then washing it off would actually pull dirt and oil right along with it. Congratulations, that's a facial. That's literally a spa facial, except it happened during the last ice age. Now here's where things get interesting, because once humans figured out fire, agriculture, and eventually civilization, hygiene didn't just continue, it exploded into something way more sophisticated than most people give credit for. Let's talk about ancient Egypt, because if there was ever a civilization that took personal cleanliness seriously, it was them. The ancient Egyptians were, frankly, hygiene overachievers. Bathing wasn't a once-in-a-while thing for them, it was a daily ritual, and for the wealthy, sometimes multiple times a day. And they didn't just rinse off with water and call it good, they made actual soap-like substances by combining animal or vegetable oils with alkaline salt, creating a paste that could cut through grease and dirt in a way plain water never could. This wasn't primitive guesswork either. Egyptian medical texts, some of which are thousands of years old, contain actual recipes for cleansing pastes, complete with specific ratios and instruction. They were essentially running skincare labs along the Nile. And it doesn't stop there. Egyptians were famously obsessed with body hair removal, and not for fashion reasons alone. Shaving the head and body was partly about hygiene, because in the hot Egyptian climate, less hair meant fewer places for lice, sweat, and bacteria to hide out and throw a party on your skin. Priests in particular were required to shave their entire bodies, head to toe, every few days because ritual purity demanded it. Meanwhile, wealthy Egyptians would wear elaborate wigs over their shaved head, which honestly sounds like the most practical fashion decision in history. Cool scalp, stylish hair, zero lice. Absolute genius. Oh, and let's not forget deodorant, because yes, that existed too. Ancient Egyptians used scented oils and various plant-based concoctions to mask body odor, some of which included ingredients like carob and incense resin. So next time you're standing in the deodorant aisle agonizing over fresh linen versus Arctic ice, just remember, someone in ancient Thebes was out here mixing frankincense into their armpit routine 4,000 years ago. Now let's hop over to the ancient Indus Valley civilization, because this one genuinely blows people's minds when they hear about it for the first time. We're talking about a civilization that existed around 2500 BCE, and they had actual indoor plumbing, not a bucket near the house plumbing. Real, honest-to-goodness drainage systems built into their cities, with covered sewers running beneath the streets, and many homes having their own private bathing areas connected to that drainage network. The city of Mohenjo-Daro even had what archaeologists call the Great Bath, a massive, carefully waterproofed public bathing structure that some believe was used for ritual purification. This was thousands of years before Rome would become famous for its baths. The Indus Valley people were out here quietly running a 5-star hygiene operation while most of the ancient world was still figuring out where to dig a hole. Speaking of Rome, we absolutely have to talk about Roman bathhouses because this is where public hygiene basically turns into a full-blown social event. The Romans did not mess around when it came to bathing. Public bathhouses called thermae were massive complexes that functioned kind of like a modern gym, crossed with a spa, crossed with a social club. You'd start in a warm room to loosen up your muscles and open your pores, move to a hot room to sweat everything out, and then plunge into a cold pool to close things back up and, presumably, scream internally. This whole process was called the tepidarium, caldarium, frigidarium routine. And honestly, that sounds like a spell from a fantasy novel, but it's just Latin for warm, hot, and cold. And here's the thing that always surprises people. Romans didn't really use soap the way we do. Instead, they used something called a strigil, which is basically a curved metal scraper. They'd rub olive oil all over their bodies, let it soak into the dirt and dead skin, and then scrape the whole mixture off with the strigil. It sounds bizarre, maybe even a little unsettling, but it worked incredibly well, removing dirt, oil, and dead skin cells in one satisfying swipe. Think of it as the ancient version of exfoliating. Except instead of a plastic loofah, you're using a metal tool that looks like it belongs in a surgeon's toolkit. Roman baths were also deeply social. People didn't just go there to get clean, they went to gossip, do business, debate philosophy, and generally hang out. Imagine your gym, your coffee shop, and your group chat all combined into one steamy marble building. That was Roman bathing culture. Cleanliness wasn't a chore, it was a lifestyle. And honestly, kind of the highlight of the day. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, because if you've ever heard anything about medieval hygiene, it's probably that everyone in medieval Europe was disgustingly filthy and bathing was basically illegal. This is one of the most persistent myths in history, and it's mostly wrong. Yes, hygiene standards did shift during parts of the medieval period, particularly after certain outbreaks led some physicians to believe that hot water opened up your pores and let disease sneak in, which understandably made people a little more cautious about long hot baths. But the idea that medieval people never washed is simply not true. Public bathhouses existed throughout medieval Europe, and they were popular. So popular, in fact, that many towns had multiple bathhouses that people visited regularly. Records from medieval cities show bathhouse attendance, bathing schedules, and even complaints about overcrowding, which is not exactly what you'd expect if nobody cared about washing. People also used simpler at-home methods like washing their hands and face daily, using linen cloths to wipe down their bodies, which actually does remove a surprising amount of dirt and oil even without water, and using herbal rinses for their hair. It wasn't the elaborate spa culture of Rome, sure, but calling medieval Europe filthy is a massive oversimplification that historians have been trying to correct for decades. So if you've been picturing knights in shining armor who smelled like a dumpster fire, you might want to update that mental image just slightly. Now let's zoom over to ancient China, because their approach to hygiene was, in some ways, way ahead of its time. Traditional Chinese medicine placed heavy emphasis on the connection between cleanliness and overall health. And bathing was considered essential not just for the body but for maintaining balance within it. The ancient Chinese used natural soap substitutes made from ingredients like soybeans and various plant extracts, and they were also pioneers of something you probably use every single day without a second thought: the toothbrush. Yes, seriously. Ancient China is credited with developing some of the earliest versions of the toothbrush using bristles made from hog hair attached to bone or bamboo handles, dating back over 1,000 years. Before that, and in many other cultures around the same time, people used what's called a chew stick, essentially a twig from a specific type of tree with antibacterial properties, which they'd chew on until the end frayed into bristle-like fibers, then used to scrub their teeth. Some of these trees, like the neem tree used in ancient India, actually contained natural compounds that fought off the same bacteria that cause cavities and gum disease. So while it looks primitive, it was in a lot of ways chemically effective. Nature basically handed them a toothbrush and toothpaste combo, and they figured out how to use it. Oral hygiene, by the way, was a huge deal across almost every ancient civilization, and it's honestly one of the most impressive parts of this whole story. The ancient Egyptians made toothpaste-like pastes out of ingredients like crushed rock salt, mint, dried iris flowers, and pepper. Yes, pepper. Imagine brushing your teeth with something that spicy every morning. That sounds less like a hygiene routine and more like a punishment. The ancient Greeks and Romans used similarly abrasive pastes, sometimes made with crushed bones and oyster shells mixed with flavoring agents, because apparently even back then, people cared about their toothpaste tasting decent. Let's talk hair for a second. because hair care in the ancient world was honestly a whole industry. In ancient India, practices that eventually formed the foundation of Ayurvedic medicine included regular oiling of the scalp and hair using oils like sesame and coconut, which helped condition the hair, reduce dandruff, and prevent lice. Many of these techniques are still used today. And if you've ever seen someone recommend a hair oiling routine online like it's some brand new wellness trend, just know that people in ancient India were doing this literally thousands of years ago. There is nothing new under the sun. There's just better marketing. In ancient Greece, both men and women used olive oil combined with various herbs to condition their hair and skin, and public bathhouses similar to those in Rome, though somewhat less elaborate, were common gathering spots. The Greeks were also big fans of scented oils, and wealthier citizens would apply different fragrances to different parts of the body, which is basically the ancient version of layering 3 different perfumes and hoping for the best. Now let's jump across the ocean, because indigenous civilizations in the Americas had some genuinely fascinating hygiene practices too, and they don't get nearly enough credit in most retellings of history. The Aztecs, for example, were remarkably clean by most standards of the time period, arguably cleaner than many contemporary European cities. Spanish conquistadors who arrived in the region actually wrote in their own records about being surprised by how frequently the Aztec people bathed, sometimes daily, using natural soap made from the root of a plant called the soap plant, which contains compounds called saponins that create a lather when mixed with water. It's basically nature's very own bar of soap, no factory required. The Aztecs also had public steam baths called temazcal, which were used for both hygiene and healing purposes. These structures were similar in concept to a sauna, using heated stones and water to produce steam, and they were believed to cleanse both the body and the spirit. Some temazcal traditions still exist today in parts of Mexico, which is a pretty incredible thread connecting modern practice all the way back through centuries of history. Now, you might be wondering, what about smell? Because let's be honest, no matter how much scrubbing and bathing was happening, ancient people didn't have deodorant sticks or body spray in a can. So how did they deal with body odor? The answer, across basically every culture we've talked about, comes down to plants. Herbs, flowers, resins, and oils were used everywhere to mask or neutralize body odor. The ancient Mesopotamians are actually credited with some of the earliest known perfume making, using techniques to extract fragrant oils from flowers and herbs as far back as 4,000 years ago. There's an actual perfume recipe preserved from ancient Mesopotamia, believed to be one of the oldest known chemistry texts in human history. Just take a moment to appreciate that. One of the earliest examples of written chemistry we have as a species isn't about medicine or metallurgy, it's about smelling nice. Priorities. Let's also talk about something people rarely think about, which is how ancient people handled things like menstruation and general bodily waste management, because that's a huge part of hygiene that often gets left out of these conversations for being, I guess, not polite enough to discuss. Ancient Egyptian women are believed to have used rolled papyrus as an early form of tampon. In ancient Greece, there's historical mention of women using lint wrapped around small pieces of wood for similar purposes. These solutions weren't perfect, obviously, but they show a level of practical problem solving that goes against the whole primitive and clueless stereotype that so many people have about ancient life. And on the topic of waste management more broadly, several ancient civilizations developed surprisingly advanced sanitation systems. We already talked about the Indus Valley's drainage systems, but the Romans also built the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest large-scale sewer systems, which is still partially in use today as part of Rome's modern drainage infrastructure. Let that sink in for a second. Some of the pipes carrying away waste in modern Rome are literally ancient Roman engineering. That's not primitive. That's just really, really good infrastructure planning. So here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If ancient people were bathing daily, using plant-based soaps, scraping off dirt with tools, brushing their teeth with antibacterial sticks, building actual sewer systems, and creating perfumes, then why does the dirty caveman stereotype persist so strongly in popular culture? Part of it comes down to survivorship bias in historical evidence. Grand temples and pyramids survive. Everyday routines like bathing and grooming often don't leave behind dramatic physical evidence, so they get overlooked in favor of flashier historical narratives. Part of it also comes down to a kind of chronological snobbery. This idea that people in the past must have known less and cared less simply because they didn't have our modern tools. But needing less technology isn't the same thing as being less clean, and honestly, some ancient hygiene routines were more environmentally sustainable than what most of us are doing right now with plastic bottles and synthetic chemicals. There's also something worth appreciating here about human ingenuity in general. Across completely different continents with zero communication between these civilizations, humans independently arrived at remarkably similar solutions. Oil-based cleansers, abrasive scrubs, plant-based deodorizers, structured drainage systems, dedicated bathing rituals. This wasn't coincidence, and it definitely wasn't luck. It was human, over and over again throughout history, prioritizing cleanliness because it mattered for health, for social standing, for religious purity, and yes, sometimes just because it's good to not be covered in yesterday's dirt. So the next time you're standing in the shower, mindlessly scrubbing away with a bottle of shampoo that probably has 40 ingredients you can't pronounce, take a second to think about the fact that you're participating in a tradition that stretches back tens of thousands of years. You're not doing anything new. You're just doing an updated version of what an Egyptian priest was doing 4,000 years ago, or what a Roman senator was doing with a strigil and some olive oil, or what an Aztec citizen was doing in a steam-filled temazcal. The tools changed. The instinct never did. Humans have never wanted to be dirty. We've always wanted to feel clean, to smell decent, to take care of our bodies in whatever way our available resources allowed. Sometimes that meant mud and river water. Sometimes it meant elaborate bathhouses with heated pools and social gossip sessions. Sometimes it meant chewing on a stick from a tree that happened to fight bacteria. But in every single era, in every single culture we've looked at today, the drive toward cleanliness was there, quietly running in the background of human civilization the entire time. And honestly, maybe that's kind of comforting, because no matter how far back you go, no matter which ancient city or village or riverside settlement you drop into, you'd find people doing some version of exactly what you did this morning. Waking up, washing up, trying to feel a little more human before facing the day. Some things, it turns out, never really change.